Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. Big day today. It's election day, and I'm going to tell you right now why I think you should be a one issue voter and why I think this election is incredibly important. Every single election they say, well, this one is the most important one in history. Maybe not. But I can say with 100% confidence that whether this is the most important in history, we'll have to see, but it's incredibly important for the reasons I'm going to talk about right now. Let's get into it. And the one issue that I am referring to is free speech. So I had this conversation with my good buddy Mike Maloney. We were in Las Vegas. Actually, it might have been a conversation prior to then, but I've been seeing Mike a lot lately, which is fantastic. But we were talking about the education system and how you fix, what's going on with this woke agenda and everything that you guys, you already know about this. I'm preaching to the choir. And the conclusion was free speech fixes this. It's a lot like that Bitcoin saying in the Bitcoin community, where the maxis always say, well, Bitcoin fixes this. Whatever it is, Bitcoin fixes this. And to a certain degree, I'm the same way with free speech, especially with the internet. Because no matter how bad the education system is, and no matter how crazy the teachers are, if we have free speech and an open discourse, if we allow dissenting views, and those people are actually heard, then over short periods of time, yes, we can absolutely go off the deep end as far as just taking the crazy train. But I think over the long run, people revert back to sanity. As an example, Josh is on the live stream right now. Josh is 20, 21, something like that. Josh, how old are you?
22.
22. Okay, so how much of what you know today did you learn in high school?
I don't think I learned anything in high school.
Okay, so there's my point. everything Josh learned, he pretty much learned on the internet and by networking with successful people. And not too many woke folks in that crowd. So the teachers weren't able to brainwash him, is my point, because he had the internet to go to and we had freedom of speech. We did have censorship, but fortunately, we didn't have censorship to the degree to which Josh couldn't hear the truth. And this is what I think is very important. I mean, right now, as an example, in Australia, they are proposing laws that would make it illegal to criticize their central bank. Think about that. I mean, look at this hat that I have right here. If I was in Australia, that hat could basically be illegal. I could be thrown in jail for having that hat just in my video, let alone wearing it or giving it out to people at Rebel Capitalist Live, which I do, or sell it. I can't remember whether we give it out or sell it. But you see my point. Everything revolves around freedom of speech. Now, do I like Trump? Not really. You guys know that I pretty much dislike all politicians. It's just to what degree do I dislike them? I think his economic policies are completely insane, but Kamala's are just as insane, if not more so. And so I could go down the list as to why I don't like Trump or why I do. And I could go down the list as to why I don't like Kamala Harris. I don't know if there's anything I actually like about her. But the bottom line is none of that really matters when you compare those issues or policies with their policy around censorship and freedom of speech. Trump is hands down the best on this issue. So what I want to do on this video is I want to go back in time because, I'm not really a history buff. I'm not that good with history. As most of you know, I almost flunked out of high school. I was pretty much the pre-Josh. But unfortunately, back then we didn't have the internet. But I didn't have to deal with all the woke teachers either. So I want to go back in history because I did some research for this video, which is rare. And I was surprised that freedom of speech is so ingrained in U.S. history, even prior to the Constitution, that I think there's a lot of evidence which could accurately lead you to the conclusion that if you're against free speech or if you're for censorship, you are actually anti-American. It's not just un-American to want to censor disinformation, as an example. It's actually anti-American. This goes against almost everything that our country was built on. It's one of the main reasons why people came here to begin with. And this was way prior to the 1780s and the 1790s. You know, call it the American Revolution. So I found this article, which I think you guys are going to find fascinating. Let's go through this. It's extremely important to understand what this country was built on when deciding, who to vote for. Because I think a lot of it's just noise. Trump goes out there and just says whatever he wants to say. Who knows? Kamala Harris is just basically a sock puppet. But they have this policy, whether it's tariffs or whether it's price controls and this, and I'm for abortion, blah, 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 whatever, right? To me, that's pretty much all noise. This is the signal. What is your position on free speech and censorship? Let's get over to this and you'll see what I'm referring to. Actually, first and foremost, I think this tweet from Luke Rudowski sums it up really well. I've seen quite a few people wear this t-shirt in airports. Make Orwell fiction again. And kind of the basis for what I'm getting at right here is this push that you guys have seen. Again, I know I'm preaching to the choir about how we need to censor misinformation and disinformation and malinformation and blah, 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 blah. When since 2020, the people that have been most guilty of spreading misinformation have been the entities that accuse other people of spreading misinformation. A great example here, mainstream media, Bloomberg. I tweeted this out last night. Disinformation is permeating the 2024 U.S. presidential election on an unprecedented scale. Really? Well, first of all, how do you know that? Like, how do you quantify that? And secondly, if disinformation is permeating the 2024 U.S. presidential election, it's coming directly from the mainstream media. It's coming from the people like Bloomberg who are accusing the plebs out there, or Russia or Putin or whatever it is, of spreading this misinformation and disinformation. They're the ones that are doing it. It goes back to what Barnes says all the time. My good buddy Robert Barnes, which someone told me he got from, who is a psychologist? Yoon, if I'm saying that correctly. You guys know who I'm referring to. But it's confession through projection. Confession through projection. Anytime you see someone that's talking about how we, like Hillary Clinton as an example, that we need to censor disinformation, we need to censor this, censor that. They are the ones that are most guilty of lying. And the people today, if you don't study history, you can sit there and you can actually justify this. Well, maybe, I don't know, maybe we should censor misinformation. Maybe we do need the thought police out there. I mean, maybe it is beneficial. I mean, my goodness gracious, if people are saying something wrong about the cerveza sickness medicine, well, that can lead to bad things. This is the justification. The bottom line is the argument is always, 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 if we don't censor people, it's going to be dangerous for the population at large. This, and we're going to go back in history here to the beginning of the United States, but this is always, always the argument. And what we see every single time is the people, the entities that are arguing in favor of censorship, that are arguing against free speech, are always the bad guys. Always. 100% of the time. They're always on the wrong side of history. The people who stand up and fight for freedom, liberty, and freedom of speech are always the good guys. They're always the people who have been on the right side of history. So why would today be any different? Let's get into this article, and you are going to be blown away, I know I was, by the parallels of what we have lived through in American history and what we are living through today in 2024. This, I want to give a shout out here. This is learnliberty.org. So if you just, I'm assuming if you just Google that and history of free speech in America, this article will come up. I strongly suggest reading the entire thing. It's fantastic. But I went through and highlighted some of the key talking points. So first and foremost, they talk about how freedom of speech is something that's very unique to America, at least the way we frame it or our worldview. Let's get into it here. Americans have a constitutional right to put forth dissenting ideas. Dissenting ideas. So if you believe that masks are nonsense, that is a dissenting idea. And remember, the argument back then was, well, they're private companies. I'm talking about social media. Well, they're private companies. They're private companies. And I agree with that. The private companies should be able to, this is actually where I disagree with Barnes slightly, because his view is that it's the town square or something like that. I forgot how he refers to it. We've actually had this conversation. But I'm almost an absolutist. But if that's your business, right? Look, if you don't want to serve gays, or go nuts. If you want to only serve gays, if you want to only serve blacks or whatever, if you want to ban certain speech, if it's your business, I mean, go nuts, right? But what we found by Elon Musk buying Twitter is that's not what's happening here, is it? What's happening is the government is coming in and effectively banning speech through pressuring, or through this relationship, crony capitalism, whatever you want to call it, with the social media platforms themselves. So this is stemming from the government. And of course, the social media platforms, most of them, I'm sure, were happy to go along with it because they all buy into this narrative as to how it's their duty to censor because these ideas are dangerous, right? As though this is the first time in American history that we've had this debate. Right? Let's keep going. You'll see what I'm talking about. So something individuals can be fined or thrown in jail over in many other countries. The significance of free speech in America is deeply rooted in history. Indeed, freedom of speech and religion played an important role in the founding fathers believing that free exchange of ideas and opinions, free market of ideas, That's the best way that I can describe. I've got to remember that because I think that's the best way to describe this. A free market of ideas. And look, in a free market of ideas, it's going to be just like a free market economy. There's going to be, pardon my French here, there's going to be shitty businesses, right? And just like in a free market of ideas, there's going to be shitty ideas. But that doesn't mean that we need to have centralized control. That doesn't mean that just because there's shitty businesses that are going to go bust and people are going to lose money, they're going to lose jobs, they're going to do all these things, that doesn't mean that a better system on net balance is central control in communist Russia, where none of the businesses go bust. Same thing with a free market of ideas. They say this was essential to functioning society and our political system. So we start by going back to free speech and the American Revolution. The First Amendment to the U.S., this is where most people start. At least this is where I thought free speech started, at least the idea, in the United States. And again, that's because I'm not really good at history. I didn't study it too much. I definitely tuned out during high school. So the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1791, protects the right to free speech along with freedom of religion, the press, assembly, and petition. The origin of free speech and religious freedom in early American history can be traced back to the colonial era. And this is what I didn't realize here. Let's start with the first key talking point under this section. However, in the early days of the colonies, again, prior to the American Revolution, freedom of speech and religious freedom were not always guaranteed. Many of the colonies were established with a specific religious denomination in mind, and dissenters were often met with harsh punishment. So you guys have heard me say many, many times that I think politics in the United States has unequivocally become a religion. I mean, you might have a different view, but I think there's a lot of evidence that this, people have abandoned going to church as a Christian or a Catholic or whatever it is, and they have adopted this new God or this new religion that and in a new form of basically the 10 Commandments, where you have to abide by these rules. And if you don't, we should cast you out because you are, you're blaspheming our higher power or whatever it is, right? And let's remember that if we could take a time machine back to these colonial days where they're talking about the Massachusetts Bay Colony as an example, right here. This was a Puritan society where authorities routinely censored publications and punished those who spoke out against their strict religious laws. Fast forward today, it's censor publications and punish those who speak out against their woke viewpoint, let's say. Those are completely interchangeable. Or their laws around climate change, right? When you look at transgenderism, when you look at the climate change narrative or hysteria, right? It is the exact same thing as this Puritan colony back in the early days of the United States. So this was called, I think I said this, Massachusetts Bay Colony, where they were doing the exact same things that the woke crowd is doing today. And not just the woke crowd, pretty much the people on the left, if you want to call that the mainstream media, the useful idiots, the politicians, the central planners, the authoritarians. This is their worldview. They are effectively today's version of the Puritan Massachusetts Bay Colony. And why were they doing this? Like if we could go back in that time machine, like I was saying, and we asked the Puritans, why are you censoring people? Why are you punishing those who have a slightly different view? What would they say? They would say the exact same thing that Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton or the mainstream media are the central planners, the authoritarians, the exact same thing they're saying today. Because if we allow these people to speak, well, it's dangerous to society. We can't allow society to hear a dissenting view. No, 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 no. This would be against the religion. Let's keep going. The parallels here are shocking. One key figure in the movement was Roger Williams, a Puritan minister banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony for his dissenting views. You know what this almost reminds me of? The first person that comes to mind is Brett Weinstein. I mean, same thing. Or any of the doctors that had dissenting views during the cerveza sickness. While freedom of speech may not be explicitly mentioned in the famous 27 grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence, the concepts and restrictions related to freedom of speech can be inferred by examining the language and context of those grievances. Check this out. Here's where it gets eerily similar. Obstruction of public dissent. The grievances accuse the British government of obstructing public dissent and criticism of its policies. Wow, that one really hits home, doesn't it? This suggests a curtailment of the colonists' ability to freely express their opinions and concerns. Wow, look at the next one. Censorship and suppression. The grievances imply that the British Crown hindered the colonists' ability to express themselves by employing censorship and suppressing publications. Oh, you mean like the government calling up Twitter and saying, hey, you've got to shadow ban these people. Or, hey, you've got to kick these people off your platform. It's exactly what the British government was doing. And oh, by the way, let me remind you who was on the right side of history. Who was the bad guy? Who was the good guy? Here's where the article gets into what makes the First Amendment unique. Unlike most countries, which tend to adopt more limited approach to free speech, the First Amendment takes a broad and expansive view, providing strong safeguards to protect individual rights to express themselves freely. One important feature of the First Amendment is the concept of prior restraint. In many countries, government has the power to censor or suppress speech before it is published or disseminated. You mean like on Twitter, right? However, the First Amendment places strong limitations on the government's ability to engage in prior restraint. After reading this whole article, or even reading these few paragraphs, I am absolutely shocked. The Twitter files, or whatever that discovery process was when Elon bought Twitter, I cannot believe that isn't more of an issue, not just with the left, but also with the right. Like how are we not talking about that right now? How is that not the biggest issue or one of the biggest issues in our lifetimes? This is an example. This is a smoking gun. This is concrete evidence that the government or their agencies were breaking the law. They were intentionally, they were knowingly breaking the First Amendment. I mean, how are these people not paying a price? The people that emailed, I don't know if it was the CIA, the FBI, whatever it was. How on earth are these people not in jail? Or at least being some sort of punishment, or it's just, you see what I'm saying? Like, how is this not a bigger issue? I mean, this, in my view, and I wasn't around for Watergate, but this seems like it's 100 times bigger than Watergate. Again, let me read this last sentence. However, the First Amendment places strong limitations on the government's ability to engage in prior restraint. That's exactly what they're doing with Twitter. We have proof of this. So the bottom line here is, the way it is written in our Constitution, they err on the side of liberty rather than control. If you can take one thing away from this entire video in terms of the election, just ask yourself, which party is erring on the side of liberty and which side is erring on control in terms of censorship, freedom of speech, misinformation, disinformation, whatever you want to call it. So now they get into another thing that I had never really thought about too much. How has free speech helped drive progress in the United States? So when I think about free speech, I always kind of think of it through the terms of an individual's rights as an American. But I didn't, admittedly, I didn't really think about it through, okay, what might not have happened in the United States if it wasn't for free speech? Free speech in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. African-American activists such as MLK Jr. used their right to free speech to advocate for racial equality and to challenge discriminatory laws and policies. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963 was a seminal moment in the civil rights movement. It was organized by a coalition of civil rights organizations, including Southern Christian Leadership Conference and National Association for Advancement of Colored People. It drew 200,000 participants, peaceful demonstration. In this event, MLK Jr. delivered the iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. The march was a powerful example of how the First Amendment allowed for peaceful expression and, key here, dissenting views. Dissenting views. I know it's hard for us to get in the mindset of what the debate would have been like back then, because it's so much different today. But think about this. Just go through this thought experiment. If you could take a time machine and go back to the early 1960s, the argument for censoring MLK Jr. would have been the exact same thing as the argument for censoring Alex Jones. And I know people are going to freak out. I'm not comparing Alex Jones to MLK. Okay? I'm just saying that the argument for censoring these two people would have been very, very similar. That we have to censor XYZ person because his ideas are dangerous. We have to censor MLK Jr. because his ideas are dangerous. Again, I'm not comparing Jones's ideas with MLK. You guys can have that debate on your own. But again, the argument for censoring would be the exact same. It always goes back to the central planners, the authoritarians wanting to usurp that power and control, and using the excuse, doing it under the guise of, well, we're just doing this for your protection. It's for your own good. Trust me. You are an adult, but we're going to treat you like an infant, because secretly that's what we believe you are. In fact, we don't even believe you're an infant. We believe you are subhuman. We believe that you are part of a class of people that is inferior to the central planners and the global elite. It really, once you study this stuff, it really goes back to, I call it the Malthusian cult, which is spot on. But it's also the eugenicist cult. Because what is the view, the core view of someone who believes in eugenics? It's simply that there are some people that are just inferior to others. Literally inferior. Not based on their character. No, just based on their skin color or based on the size of their head or something like this, right? And therefore, those people, those genes just should be completely eradicated. We pin that mostly on the guy that ran Germany in the 1930s. You guys know exactly who I'm talking about. Where did he get most of his ideas? He got them from scientists in the United States. And in fact, one president that we're going to talk about here in a moment was, let's say, infamous for his views on eugenics. But if you think about what that view entails, it's a view of central planning. Because central planning, their core thesis is, well, we smart people need to control everything because we just can't let this, economy, we can't give this to the dumb rubes because they're so stupid, they're just going to blow everything up or they're going to ruin everything. And in fact, there's just, like Thanos said in the movie, the Avengers movie, there's just too many mouths and not enough resources. You see, again, it's why the Malthusian view and the eugenicist view is almost, it's like peanut butter and jelly, right? In a very disturbing way. And that's how we conquer this and how we defeat these bad ideas of Malthusianism or eugenics is, you guys know the punchline: free speech. Free speech. Because this is what allows people who have dangerous views like MLK to come out and make these speeches that are now iconic, that quite literally change the trajectory of history. And it's not just civil rights here, anti-war. The government, and this really hits home now because of everything that we saw, that we, it's getting a little less hysterical today than it was a couple years ago. But remember when Russia invaded Ukraine? I mean, that was completely bananas. Bananas. If you weren't for World War III, then you were basically an American or domestic terrorist, right? That's how you were being treated. If you didn't have that Ukrainian flag on your Twitter feed, I mean, you might as well be fired from your job because you don't deserve to have a roof over your head. I mean, this is literally how people were thinking. And it's so ironic that we actually used that law to our advantage to talk out against the war, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War. And now the same mentality, the war hawk mentality, is trying to suppress speech once again, especially, a couple years ago, around the dissenting view that, hey, maybe we shouldn't get involved with World War III. Getting back to the article, the government's, and this is Vietnam War here, the government's attempts to suppress dissent led to court cases that further expanded the scope of free speech protections. Opponents of the war utilized their right to free speech to voice their dissent And again, I'd like to remind you, who was on the right side of history in terms of the Vietnam War? And here's another component that is just so damn ironic. Back then, the media, believe it or not, was on the side of free speech. You would think it would be the exact same thing today. But in this crazy, upside down, perverse world we live in, the media is the main opponent of censorship. I mean, or the main perpetrator, the main promoter, I guess is the best word, of censorship. I guess opponent. They're the ones that are out there pushing it. Let's get back to the article here. The media played a significant role in amplifying anti-war sentiments. Journalists exercised their right to free speech by reporting on the realities of the war. You mean the realities of the war, like Russia blowing up their own pipeline? Is that what we're talking about here? Remember, it's like there was a script. And I don't know who writes this script. I don't know if it's Klaus. I don't know if it's I don't know what's going on here. I don't know if it's the publicist for the World Economic Forum, but there is a script, and there has been since 2020, that goes out to all of these politicians that are in the club, in the Malthusian eugenicist club. And they're like, here's how you need to frame this argument. And here are the specific words you need to use. Remember, we started seeing this with the cerveza sickness, where you would turn on the TV and Ursula was saying the exact same thing as Trudeau, and not even the same concept. Like, as an example, I'm good buddies with Brent Johnson. Most of you guys know that. And we have a very similar view on the dollar. But similar, but it's not identical. Like, there are some things where I would explain something much differently than Brent would. And there's some things that I just see, I see things in a different way. I mean, this is just two people having an opinion, right? The conclusion is the same, but we get there in much different ways. So if I were to explain to you why I think the dollar is that the higher probability is the dollar goes up versus down, I would explain that to you in a much, much different way than Brent would. But if I explained it to you in a way that was not just similar, but was identical, literally word for word, you would have to sit back and look at that and say, that's weird. It's almost like that's not their opinion. It's almost like they're just parroting someone else's opinion. And this is like a script that they've been given. And it was identical with the cerveza sickness. It was identical with Russia, Ukraine. I mean, just look at the last 4 years. And these authoritarians and central planners have been on point with everything as if they're reading a script. And what has the mainstream media been doing? The journalists that used to be the ones that would stand up for free speech, they were the ones that were willing to, figuratively, take a bullet for free speech. They were the ones that were willing to die on that mountain, that one issue of free speech. Now, the world is so bizarre that the journalists are the ones that are actually in favor of censorship. They are the opponents of free speech. I mean, it's unbelievable. The anti-war movement use of free speech as a means of protest and advocacy had a profound impact on public opinion and policy. Again, it's like Bitcoiners say, free speech fixes this. Attacks on free speech in American history. An important instance of censorship occurred during World War I. World War I. This is where you can kind of put on the tinfoil hat here. Let me go back. Let's actually do a little CSI investigation here. World War I. Who was president? 1917. Let's look this up. Oh, would you look at that? Woodrow Wilson. A guy that, as you'll see, was doing his very best to censor people that had a dissenting view. Now let's look at this real quick here. I mean, just some headlines here. President Woodrow Wilson, a Darwinian racist eugenicist. That's the first thing that comes up on Google. Here's Foundation for Economic Education. Woodrow Wilson, this so-called progressive, was a dedicated racist. Washington Post, the liberals who loved eugenics. Woodrow Wilson supported the science of eugenics. You see where I'm going with this? It's the same people that have this central planning view, which at the core is, I am better than you. I am superior. I'm not just better than you. I'm superior to you. You are inferior in every single way. And therefore, it is my God-given right to not only take all the power away from you and make you effectively a subject, but it is also my God-given right to eradicate you from the earth if I feel like you're just consuming too many of the resources. Because we need to save those resources for the people that are superior. We need to prevent those scarce resources being consumed by the people that are inferior. This is the premise of central planning. This is the premise of authoritarianism. And it's just in its scientific form is eugenics. So why on earth, if you had that worldview that you and the people around you are superior, then of course you would be in favor of censorship. And of course you would think that a free market of ideas is a bad thing, which is exactly the position that Woodrow Wilson took. Getting back to the article. The important instance of censorship occurred during World War I when Congress enacted the Espionage Act. This legislation posed a direct threat to the First Amendment by criminalizing any act that could incite rebellion or impede the recruitment of soldiers. So at face value, a normie that didn't really study history might say, okay, yeah, whatever. They wouldn't realize what a slippery slope this was and how this law could be used to completely crush, destroy individual rights. Let's keep going. Additionally, the Postmaster General was granted the authority to censor certain forms of communication that advocated resistance to U.S. laws. Eugene Debs, a prominent labor leader and socialist political figure, was arrested and convicted in 1918 under the Sedition Act, which extended the Espionage Act, extended the Espionage Act. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for delivering, listen to it, anti-war speech criticizing the government's handling of World War I. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson. Good job. I would expect nothing less from a eugenicist. And then it took, and ironically, the American public think that Woodrow Wilson was a great guy, great president. Like, are you kidding me? This guy was the dregs of our society. And then ironically, if you ask the American public about Warren Harding, like, oh, he was terrible, he just didn't do anything. Well, he did one thing, and that was one of the first things he did, was he commuted his sentence in, what do they call it? They pardon. Effectively, as I understand it, Warren Harding pardoned Eugene Debs and allowed him to come out of prison because Harding knew that this was totally not just immoral, but it was anti-American. That Eugene Debs, like him or hate him, whatever, he had the right, especially as a politician, for heaven's sakes, to say whatever it is he wanted to say, regardless as to whether he was dissenting against the way the eugenicists were handling World War I. And by the way, it is very, very suspicious, let's say, that one of the key components of Malthusianism is that we need to have wars. We need to have famine. This is a natural occurrence. And although, it kind of sucks in the short term, in the long run, it's fantastic because it thins the herd, right? And who are you sending to the front lines, by the way? Are you sending the central planners and the authoritarians? Are you sending the superior people? No, of course not. You're sending the lower classes. You're sending the plebs. You're sending the inferior people. And it just so happens that it's rather convenient that those people have all the bad genes. They have the inferior genes, and we're just sending them to the front lines to get slaughtered. Where all the people with the good genes are back home sipping champagne, eating filet mignon and caviar. It makes you scratch your head a little bit and say, I wonder what the true motivation of the war was. Was it freedom, liberty, defending the Constitution? Or was it thinning the herd? I'll let you be the judge. The Red Scare. So McCarthyism. Led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, the nation was gripped by fear and suspicion of communist infiltration. As a result, civil liberties were trampled upon. And here's another example of where the people that were standing up for free speech, or in this case, being persecuted for their views, are now the exact same people that are trying to persecute others for having a dissenting view. And by the way, the dissenting view from others today has been proven right over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's like I say, today's truth is yesterday's misinformation. Let's get back to the article. One of the most glaring examples of censorship during the second Red Scare was the creation of Hollywood's notorious blacklist. Is it any different today? I mean, we don't literally have a blacklist, but or we don't explicitly have a blacklist, but implicitly, don't we? I mean, ask anyone in Hollywood that works in Hollywood if they're allowed to be a Trump supporter and how many jobs they would get moving forward if they came out of the closet as someone that wasn't voting for Kamala Harris and the central planners. Right? They're done. They're done. And I know I keep beating a dead horse here, but I really want you guys to go through these examples and just ask yourself, because I'm sure a lot of people that don't study history think that they can be persuaded to see the benefits in censorship. But when you go back and look at it through this lens and then just ask yourself, okay, well, wait a minute, Eric. Okay, I kind of see their argument, but boy, oh boy, we've got a lot of examples of this throughout history. And isn't it interesting that 100% of the time, the people that were in favor of, to use their line here because it was fabulous, that were trampling on civil liberties always turned out to be the bad guys and always turned out to be on the wrong side of history. So the suspected communist sympathies or refusing to cooperate were systematically blacklisted, effectively ending their careers. This climate of fear and intimidation forced many filmmakers, actors, and writers to conform to prevailing anti-communist sentiments or remain silent, stifling creative expression and free thought. And I like how they use the word climate here, because it would be the exact same thing if you said, this climate change thing. I mean, I get it, but I don't know. Maybe it's not worth killing half the population of the world just to prevent people, or just to prevent the ocean from increasing by 0.5 degrees or something like that. And you'd get the exact same treatment, right? You'd be intimidated. You would have to silence yourself. You would have to apologize 500 times and just take that verbal lashing from everyone around you on how bad of a person you are because you believe there's only two genders. Check this out. This one I thought was incredibly profound. The academic sphere also faced significant challenges during the second Red Scare. Professors and university staff were subjected to loyalty oaths, and investigations into their political beliefs. When Russia invaded Ukraine, what was that? What was putting the flag on your Twitter feed or your Twitter profile or whatever? That was a loyalty oath. The exact same thing. What's really shocking is the people doing that, that have to stand up and say, I just so you know, I want to make it very, very clear that I've got this symbol on my Twitter feed showing that I'm not a racist, or showing that I'm standing up for Ukraine. You have all of this effectively virtue signaling today, and it's the exact same nonsense we saw, just with, instead of whatever the flavor of the week is today, back then it was communism. That was the boogeyman. Now we're getting into freedom of speech in the Jim Crow era and the fight for civil rights. One prominent example is the Freedom Riders. So I'd never heard of these people. I really enjoyed this part of the article. One prominent example, again, is the Freedom Riders, a group of activists who aimed to challenge racial segregation on interstate buses and in bus terminals. The first thing that came to mind when I saw freedom riders, the truckers, Canadian truckers. The Alabama state government, led by Governor John Malcolm Peterson, made efforts to prevent the freedom riders from entering the state and disrupting their activities. Actually, I should have highlighted this whole thing. Let's go back. The freedom riders, including both African-American and white activists, traveled to Alabama in May 1961 as a part of their journey through the Deep South. Truckers, Canadian truckers, exact same. Upon their arrival, they were met with violent opposition from white supremacists. Well, the Canadian truckers were met with opposition from the central planners, Justin Trudeau himself, which would be the 1960s version of this Governor John Malcolm Peterson. We might as well call John Justin for Justin Trudeau. They did the exact same thing. Upon their arrival, they met with violent opposition, white supremacists, and encountered resistance from local authorities. The Alabama state government, led by Justin Trudeau, made efforts to prevent their freedom riders from entering the state and disrupting their activities. Free speech in universities. And you guys know how this has been completely inverted. Free speech is particularly crucial within the context of universities, where the pursuit of knowledge, critical thinking, and intellectual growth are paramount. It's almost like we live in the opposite world. It's like that Superman episode where there was like the Superman from a parallel universe that was actually a bad guy. That's what we're living in today. Universities and colleges and college campuses should be bastions of free expression, fostering an environment where diverse ideas, not monolithic ideas, diverse ideas can flourish, and students can engage in robust debates and challenge their preconceptions and expand their intellectual horizons. Sounds good to me. Again, free speech fixes this. Instead of fostering an environment of robust debate and critical thinking, censorship imposes a chilling effect on intellectual discourse. It breeds an atmosphere of conformity. This gets eerie, doesn't it? Where individuals are hesitant to express their opinions for fear of retribution or being labeled as politically incorrect. And here's where they reference actually what we're today's phenomenon, if you want to call it that. Indeed, in 2020, a national survey by the Cato Institute found 62% of Americans say they have political views they're afraid to share. Attacks against free speech on campus are often rationalized based on the need to create a safe and inclusive space for all students. Advocates for censorship argue there are certain ideas or forms of expression can be harmful. The exact same argument that the colonies, the Puritan colony would have made prior to the American Revolution. The exact same argument that all the white supremacists would have made for censoring MLK Jr. The exact same argument that Woodrow Wilson would make against Eugene Debs. The exact same argument that the politicians or the central planners would have made against the people protesting the Vietnam War. The exact same argument that Justin Trudeau made against the truckers, and the exact same argument that his Ku Klux Klan counterpart, the guy that was running Alabama, made in 1961. Can you say on the wrong side of history? Why does free speech matter so much? Free speech stands out as a lifeblood of a truly free society, a fundamental pillar that we must fiercely defend. It is through the open exchange of ideas, even those we vehemently disagree with, and this is key. The basis for freedom of speech is through the law to protect people with bad ideas. It's to protect speech that is detestable. It is to protect people you disagree with. Freedom of speech doesn't mean we should allow everyone to say whatever they want as long as they agree with the mainstream narrative, the eugenicists, the Malthusians, the authoritarians, and the central planners. That is not what free speech means. This fosters progress, challenge oppressive systems, and safeguards our liberties. The marketplace of ideas thrives on the notion that the best way to combat bad ideas is not through censorship, but through exposure, debate, and reasoned discourse. That is why I am a one-issue voter, and that is why I am voting for Donald Trump, even though I don't really like him. Because if he is going to stand up for censorship or do so in a way that's just even better than the other side, which is openly championing censorship, then it's not really a decision. It's easy. This is a no-brainer. I'm going to stand up for freedom of speech. Because at the end of the day, you know you're going to be on the right side of history. You know that you are combating the bad guys. And you know that this is the ethical stance. And like the Bitcoiners say, whatever you're worried about today, and there's a lot to be worried about, to be stressed out over, free speech fixes this. All right, guys, enjoy your day. I don't usually say this, but be safe, especially if you live in Portland or Seattle or New York or any of those things. And we'll see you in the next video.